Hello, everyone. Welcome to the antonym book discussion for the month of April, which focuses on Indian science fiction, its past, present, and the path ahead. I'm Sreya Sarkar, the nonfiction editor at the Antonym, and today I have with me Dr. Suparno Banerjee, professor and scholar of science fiction and post-colonial literature, to discuss his book, Indian Science Fiction, Patterns, History, and Hybridity, that was published last year in October. This book is a very detailed academic work on understanding the patterns and history of science fiction in India, the first of its kind that examines the historical development of the genre across multiple languages in the Indian subcontinent. Welcome, Suparno. Thank you so much for giving us your time.
And thank you, Shreya.
In the very beginning, it would be great if you could share a bit about your academic background and your interests, and then perhaps tie it to how that motivated you to write the book.
Okay, maybe I can talk about my interest about science fiction and then tie it to academic background, because I've been reading science fiction forever, like from childhood, starting with I guess Bengali science fiction, Bangla science fiction, and translation from Russian and English, and then moving on to English American and whatever I could get my hands on, I guess, when I was very, very young. So in a sense, my academic career, when I decided to get into literary studies, it has always been already have been determined by what I want to do, I guess. So I did my undergraduate studies and MA from Vishwabharati University, Shantiniketan. That's where I'm from originally, in India. And then got my PhD from Louisiana State University in US, where science fiction was my primary focus. And my dissertation was on Indian English science fiction writing. I guess that was probably one of the earliest dissertations to address that topic as well. And in a sense, since we are talking about the book, it germinated at that point, or rather started forming the ideas, because when I was writing my dissertation, it was focused on representation of India, both in Indian English science fiction, because I was in the English department, so primarily focused on English literary works, but also how India is often portrayed in English language SF from the West. So let's say US, UK, Canada, so on and so forth. So that was the study. And at that time, it kind of started thinking that, all right, India has so many languages, right? And there are so many different linguistic literary traditions where you have science fiction. So when I was doing my research, there's scant sources. There's not a lot of research done, a few here, a few there. So I thought there should be someone, if it has to be someone, why not me? I should start kind of collecting them. And that's sort of the starting point. So in a sense, the research has taken me, more or less around 7 or 8 years, from 2010 onwards.
Can you imagine, yeah.
And writing portion was not that long, but finding the information, spent almost 3 months in India doing some field work, like going through libraries, National Library. And fortunately, I have a pretty good collection of older magazines, Bengali magazines at home. My parents kept it more or less in good shape. So going through that sort of thing, for a semester, I got a sabbatical from the university. So that kind of led me to doing this thing. But as you can tell, in India, you can mostly understand, 2 or 3 languages at most. So that's been a big challenge, but I was able to find some translations in some cases. I had to take help from other people in kind of providing me sources, resources, and things like that. So I guess that in a nutshell is my kind of background and interest in doing this project.
Right. It's been a long journey for sure. An interesting one.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, let's just jump into your book. You did spend some time defining Indian science fiction, Indian separately, and then science fiction as well as a term. Now, it seems that the definition has evolved with time. And if so, why would you think so? And how is that relevant for your book? Because I know that kind of ties everything together and, also maps the whole book and its course. So if you could tell me a bit about that.
Okay, yeah, sure. Now, if you come to think about it, when I'm trying to, anybody who tries to write, let's say, anything from a national tradition perspective, it's strategic. It makes strategic sense to define the area. So that's why I spent some time trying to figure out. We all know what Indian is, in a sense, but we also don't know what it is when you try to pin that on. So, given that I talked about or I explored things at least over the last 175 years or so. So I had to define what is Indian. So that's the reason I had a separate section for that. And science fiction, I'm using that word in its broader understanding as a generic marker, global generic marker, but its usage varies from place to place, the different kind of work that we get in different literary traditions. So in a sense, like Bengali literary tradition or Hindi literary tradition is one kind or similar kinds, but when it comes to, let's say, the Anglo-American usage of the word, it can differ a little bit. So that's why I was trying to figure out something that suits the definition for the works that I am talking about that are coming out of India or Indian culture. And any definition would evolve over time because things evolve over time. The kind of cultural productions that happen evolve over time. So nothing is static. I would say I do provide a definition, which I guess goes along this line, if you want to kind of at least want me to mention that. I go along with some variation of Dr. Suvin's idea of science fiction as a cognitive estrangement. That is, two opposite forces of cognition, which he equates with science, and estrangement, which is a factor that defamiliarizes the world. They are the two forces that make science fiction function, in a way of saying. So I was kind of using a variation of that, not exactly that, but something that gives an appearance of things happening in a naturalistic world, not supernatural occurrences, but something that we don't see every day. The authors don't see every day. So something radically different from the author's perspective. What I was doing is a variation of that. And when I start looking at 19th century works, the kind of applicability of that is not the same as in the 20th century works or the 21st century work. So I'm not trying to put everything within a straight jacket, but some loose definition, something along that line, and then obviously moving with the evolving trend of literary production or cultural production, if you want to say. So that's why it's evolving. It can never stay same. It has to be defined in relationship to other genres, other forms of literary production. So like when cinema comes along, you start seeing similar sort of text there as well, or productions there as well. But they are not exactly the same as what we saw in literary productions.
Thank you. So I also see that you have a background in post-colonial literature and an interest in that. It's great how you talk about nationalism and post-colonialism and the influence of it on Indian science fiction. This is something which might be new to people who are reading it for the first time, because there is not a natural connection sometimes made. But you do it beautifully in your book, and you again scan the history and bring it out. If you could talk a bit about that.
Sure. Now, let me go back to the earlier part of science fiction text, which I see it kind of beginning at 1835. Other people have tried to connect it to the older myths and epics and so on and so forth. And again, as I said, my view doesn't have to be the only one. It's just for how I look at it. And if I do, the reason I look at it that way is that that's 1835, Kailash Chandra Dutta's journal of the year 1945 is a text set in future, more than 100 years in the future, depicting events 100 years in the future. Now, Indian science fiction, according to me, has a very strong connection to its response to European colonization. That first text was written in English. 1835 is a very, very important year. That's the year Macaulay's, Thomas Bepington Macaulay's famous proposal of introducing English education in India was made. Proposing to create this middleman, a class who would serve the British well if they're educated in the British way and learn the English language. And what do we get in 1835 by English educated Bengali guy? We get a text in which he imagines a rebellion against the British, attempt to throw them out of the country. And 10 years later, his cousin Shashi Chandra Dutta writes Orissa, where he shows that they have defeated the British and carved out a nation. So if you think about that as one of the birth moments of Indian science fiction, you can see why nationalism and post-colonialism would be inherently connected. And we can then go on forward in history, but I say from the very beginning, it's inherently connected. And obviously the book goes in much detail of what the other things are. Science fiction's ability to imagine alternative universes, radically different spaces and times and societies, I believe makes it a very good vehicle for imagining things that they're not being able to do at that time. Which is, for any colonized society, would provide an alternative vision. Or for post-colonial society, whose histories have been violated, whose knowledge has been violated, a device for reimagining the past or for iterating their future. Because if you look at the dominant science fiction culture, it has historically been dominated by Anglo-American tradition or other European traditions. So it's a genre that can let the people of post-colonial world portray their future and reimagine their past. And that's what Indian science fiction has been doing. So on the one hand, this is a very strongly post-colonial, I would say, device or a tool that the authors have been using in challenging authorities, European authorities. So that's the post-colonial part. And the nationalism part is also related to that. Establishing national heritage is one way of responding to coloniality. But it can also work as a device for raising the other sort of nationalism, exclusion of others. Right. So it works both ways. I would just remind you, maybe, I don't know if you've watched this movie, the othering device is very strong in science fiction in general. The alien has been often portrayed as dangerous in American science fiction. So the invasion of the body snatchers or Mars attacks, things like that. So some sort of xenophobic representation.
Right. Again, very relevant the way things are playing out right now. It just becomes very relevant, puts everything in
Yes.
context. Yeah.
And
So,
Indian science fiction has done both ways. Like I would say some works which tries to establish this exclusive, um, primarily Hindu nationalist agenda in some cases, not necessarily directly saying that, but the way those texts represent history or mythology in that way, that makes the agenda very clear that this is sort of an exclusionary representing golden Hindu age as the past, etc., etc., which is both. It sets a post-colonial device challenging European discourses, but it's also trying to establish a mononormative discourse in that sense.
right.
But we also see the other side as well.
Right. It's interesting, because you do mention the role of mythology. And, I think that might be the next question. It's a good bridge to that. Uh, Again, something which is not obvious, for new readers, that how mythology can influence and how it has defined Indian science fiction. Again, very relevant. So if you could tell us a bit about it and how your book addresses that.
My book kind of have a half a chapter on mythology's influence on Indian science fiction, because it does play a pretty strong role in the way people deal with it. And as I was saying, it has been done both ways. Um, for one, let me backtrack a little bit, because when you asked me about the definition of Indian science fiction, and I mentioned that I look at it as starting from the early 19th century, many people have tried defining it in relationship to the myths and epics. So Mahabharata or Mahabharata Ramayana as science fiction, which I don't really go for that, because I think they function differently. Um, and I think it makes more sense to think about them as epics because they function wonderfully as epics. We don't need to link this to that. I'm very fond of reading epics as well. So I have nothing against that, but I think I read epics. I also read a lot of fantasy, so I have nothing against any of those things. I just think they're related, but they don't have to be the same thing. We don't have to do that. So even if there's that. Often there's connection, like the people's trying to define it or connect it in that way. But even if I don't connect it that way, I see a lot of influence of epic narratives, mythological narratives in providing this vast dimension. Because let's face it, like the myths and epics provide a world which is beyond our everyday understanding of things and gives you this cosmic playground that you can use it. And it's Indian science fiction is not alone in doing that. Many other science fiction traditions have done that with the Greek myths, Christian myths, with Norse myths. The latest, probably most prominent one example is probably Thor, who is now in the Marvel universe. The Thor, God of Thunder, is now in the Marvel universe.
Right.
He's a god, right?
That's
But
right.
he's
Yeah, exactly.
he's now playing around along with Iron Man and other people. Now, in case of Indian science fiction, I see often as a device of both as a device of nationalist ideological stance, but also as a post-colonial world building that is alternative to the dominant Western one. And in both cases, myths have been utilized in different ways. Sometimes you see an eagerness to reinterpret myth in scientific terms. And there I start seeing some problems, but again, they're stories, so I don't have any problems. Unless you start making claims that we had airplanes. You see what I mean? But there's nothing wrong in imagining that we had planes. That's my point. It's a story, so I should take it as a story.
Right. It's interesting how you talk about this aspirational part, how post-colonialism and the aspiration to become something different, to reimagine. So, can you discuss a bit about, utopia and dystopia in the context of Indian science fiction? And because there is this attempt to reimagine India, and also the hybridity also plays a role, I think, in trying to redefine what the future could be like, or just the idea of India is kind of transformed in this kind of work. So if you could talk a bit about that.
Sure. I would say that has been there from the very beginning. The couple of texts I mentioned, Journal published in 1835 and Orissa published in 1845, both of them try to reimagine India, what it would be to get rid of the British. So this revolutionary utopian tradition has been there for a long time. Now, there is an interesting development. I see these the positive utopian version is more dominant in the earlier part of our earlier history, so 19th, early 20th century. And two very important texts there would be Begum Rokea's Sultana's Dream, possibly one of the earliest feminist utopias written in English anywhere in the world, 1905, which imagines a world where women rule and men are behind purdah. Everything's working out fine. It's not exactly science fiction, but I still consider that. Or Rahul Sankritan's Vice Pisa, written in Hindi, which imagines a 22nd century India were along a communist line. So it's definitely influenced by the Bolshevik Revolution. This was published in 1924 and highly influenced by the revolution in Russia. So it's a third alternative vision other than the British or the Gandhi Swaraj thing. It's a different vision, third alternative. So I'm just mentioning this because there has been various ways of seeing the community, specifically India. And this vision has changed over time. As we go further towards the end of 20th century or early 20th century, we start seeing a lot of dystopia, questioning
which
the
is
social.
interesting, right?
Right. Yeah. So post-coloniality breeds more dystopias, where colonial time created more utopias. Yeah. I think it could be that the situation is so bad around there imagining some millennial dreams, like millennium vision, what would be a good thing. When we get that, we start thinking about, did we get that? Because if you come to think about it, anti-colonial movement in itself is sort of an utopian enterprise. Thinking about the land, getting rid of the bad elements. I'm just simplifying things, obviously, that getting rid of the colonizers and getting it back, it itself is a utopian enterprise. But can we sustain it? That's, I think, a question. When we get it, what then? I think that's the question that kind of dogs these later dystopian visions, where those utopian dreams did not really live up to. And we start seeing problems. And if you look at the recent history, we have many excellently written dystopian fiction, which is an effect of, I think, the problems within the country, but also problems of humanity in general. So I don't want to kind of just talk about Indian science fiction as if they confine themselves only within the problems of India. They don't. Many of them do, but they also look outside a lot.
Right. That's interesting. That switch, from utopia and dystopia time-wise, it's very interesting.
Let me add one thing here. It's not to say there are no kind of utopian, or maybe you can say heterotopian as a term here, that imagines, or rather that exposes the impossibility of imagining anything in a completely holistic manner or totalizing manner. Because utopia or dystopia imagine things in a large scale in totality, maybe under a specific sort of ideology or not. But the idea of heterotopia kind of does away with this possibility, specifically under the postmodern condition, where this idea that anything can be put under a broad umbrella has been kind of rejected. So we start seeing ambiguity in these dystopias or utopias. And we do have a few texts which kind of presents a more optimistic picture.
Interesting. Now, because you have looked at different languages, Indian languages, I was thinking that, translations do play an important role when it comes to reading Indian science fiction. All of them will not be written in English. So I think you specifically look at a few languages. You look at Bangla, Marathi, and a few others. So, my question here is that what role do you think translations will play or are playing in making the genre more accessible or popular in India as well as in other countries?
Very good question, and I think it's a very important one that the authors and editors need to pick up, because as we all know, nobody can read every language, right? Probably many people can read English. So translating things into English would make it more accessible. There's no doubt about that. And translation across the borders of indigenous languages happen. It's not like that they don't happen, but not as much as desirable. There have been a few collections in which SF from multiple languages have been translated into English. It Happened Tomorrow, that collection title, It Happened Tomorrow, is probably one of the earliest ones. Came out in 1993 by National Book Trust. Important book because it tried to kind of combine at least 6 or 7 different linguistic traditions under English. And then it was translated into other languages, into Bangla and Hindi, I think. Things like that would make things a lot more accessible. For example, I can read Bangla, I can read Hindi. Since Oshomia is written more or less using the very same font as, script as Bangla. You see like what it does when you use computer too long. You talk about font, not script. Bangla, I kind of tried reading a few stories, and I think I more or less succeeded. I sort of tried teaching myself the language because after reading it, I talked to some of my friends who are Oshomia, and they said I more or less understood the stories. So the problem is that I couldn't read more than 2 or 3 plus English language. So I had to depend on translations into Hindi, translation into Bangla, translations into English for that matter. And that's why this task is so difficult when I was writing the book. And I don't think it's a perfect book either, because there are lots of flaws, lots of gaps. There would be. But my point was that it's still possible, and this is the beginning, so that other people takes up and look at those specific language traditions and write about them. So translation would mean a lot across cross-linguistic tradition. Translation would mean a lot, and there are some. It's not like they're not. And translation into English, which is happening more these days, would mean globalization of Indian SF, which is happening now. A lot of people are writing in English. The problem with that is that the West, or English-speaking world, is accessing only those works. Those works are wonderful, but they're not getting to read this gold mine of indigenous language SF because they are not being translated. So there are a few efforts. I know the Golan's Book of Science Fiction, it's just from the top of my head. There are others as well, edited by Tarun Sen. They compiled primarily English language SF from South Asia, but there were quite a few translated works as well, which is, I would say, important, because that sort of anthology would have more visibility outside of the country. So that kind of leads to globalization of Indian SF, which in my book, I mentioned that I start seeing it as towards the end of the 90s, and now is the period, I think.
What would be interesting is, if at some point of time you could give us a list of books that have recently come out, that have been published and that are good translations, because we did have this discussion a while back, a few months back, that sometimes things are lost in translation as well, because translations are not perfect. So that's the problem some people have when they are reading English. Though, I mean, of course, the translator has to have the knowledge of both the languages, but sometimes certain jargon, certain incidents just don't fit. So I think that's a struggle that the translation world has to deal with from time to time. But thank you so much. This was such a very interesting and insightful discussion. I found out so many new things, really. I mean, this connection with, nationalism, mythology, how utopia, dystopia, and how they flip with time. I think that's very interesting. And I'm sure the antonym audience also has learned a lot from this. And I wish you all the best for your book and for your all future endeavors. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sreya, and it was my pleasure, and thank you for inviting me over.